just want to come look at the bricks. That's how you make a decision worth tens of thousands of dollars, is you think the bricks are pretty. But that's pretty much what I did. And got into college. You know, freshman year, they make you take a lot of standard stuff. You know, you got language, math, English. None of those were great courses for me. So I made a 175, and I had to come home over Christmas break where my dad opened up that envelope where they mailed the grades. And then I got both eyebrows looking at me. But what eventually happened is I had to take a prereq for interior design, and it was a history of interiors class. Never heard of it. That's not something they teach in most schools. And I'll never forget the professor because her name was Dr. Dull. Why she did not change her name legally, I do not know. But Dr. Dull. And it was all about furniture. And like pieces of furniture. Like I didn't know that like there are different kinds of table legs, and different kinds of table legs have different names. And different kinds of chairs have different names. And I actually thought that was kind of interesting. It was like anatomy, but instead of learning the bones on a body, I was learning pieces on tables and chairs and then some buildings. And I went from, you know, hanging in at a 175. Within 2 years, I was on academic overload with a 4.0. And then I was recruited for fellowship for a PhD. So what this really means is you find your passion. You find what is going to keep you up at night, what is going to make you love doing it. And it might take a while. I didn't find mine in high school. But I went back after I finished my PhD because we had the same guidance counselor, and I tracked her, and I was like, do you remember me? Remember you told me I need to be taking more math and science? And she recognized my face. Oh, how are you doing? I'm like, I just finished my PhD and I published. And I didn't take more math and science. I took more art. Thank you. Remember that, you know, find your passion. So mine's buildings, clearly, bricks. I newly work with the city of Decatur. I'm the preservation specialist, so I work with federal tax credits for rehabbing historic buildings. I help people in the historic districts. And I'm going to look at buildings and going to show you a way to look at buildings that's probably a little different than how you look at buildings. You guys know what this is? What is this building? You've seen it. It's Old State Bank. So you've probably heard, it's like a classical Greek building. That kind of stuff normally puts you to sleep. They're going to tell you the pieces, parts. There's an entasis here, and a capital, and a column, and a shaft, and a base. But what's really interesting with these buildings is why they exist. Because buildings control space and identity, and they show politics. Because somebody paid a lot of money for this. If they paid a lot of money for this, they want it to look a certain way because they're sending a message. And what is that message that they want to send? Well, in this case, it's not an exact replica, but you can kind of see a family resemblance. This is the Maison Carré in France. This building is the building that Thomas Jefferson saw. Anybody know what Jefferson's role was in France? He was essentially very much like an ambassador. Well, I'm from Virginia, so I grew up hearing lots of stuff about Jefferson. Jefferson's in France, and he's missing all the exciting stuff in the US because we're building a new country. And Jefferson is acutely aware that the buildings matter because we're basically a bunch of uneducated hicks in the US. We don't have any major colleges yet. We don't have trained architects or sculptors or painters like they do in Europe. And Jefferson wants to make sure that we are presenting a solid face because it wouldn't be that hard for any other country in Europe that had a decent army to take us over again. So we better look like we're on our A game. So Jefferson focuses on architecture, and he writes about this being the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and it's classic, and it lasts, it's 200 AD, this thing lasts forever. We want to last forever, right? We want to look like we've already been there forever. So Jefferson sells the Virginia state legislature on this design. He knows they're building a new state capitol. And he says, you know, this is what you've got to do. So this is the Virginia state capitol. Ignore these. These are the wings. Focus on this part right here. And Jefferson, they're already putting in a foundation with some bricks. And they're just a bunch of tobacco farmers. They're going to do something kind of redneckish. And Jefferson's embarrassed. And he writes them a letter. Goes, no, 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 no. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be beautiful. We're going to be sophisticated. I will get an architect in Paris and we'll design it for you. And meanwhile, the politicians in Richmond are like, God bless Jefferson. We don't give a goodie. Like, we're tired of your flowery letters, your fluffing up stuff. And Jefferson's like, wait, don't screw it up. They finally just pulled it off in time. They'd actually started to lay the foundation, and he had enough political clout to get it rearranged, and they built his perfect temple of governance. Stability, power, longevity. Does this look familiar?
Yes.
What is it?
Alabama State Capitol.
Alabama State Capitol. You start to see a family resemblance here?
Columns.
We're in the South. But it's this time period, actually. They like columns. But there's that classical design. They could have picked Egyptian, Chinese, Japanese. They could have picked Gothic, any other numbers of styles. But we keep coming back to this. So when they did the old state bank, they deliberately, you're starting a new branch of the Alabama government. You're putting in a bank. You want it to have this stability. You're not going to mess with the formula. I mean, Jefferson set the formula. And you will still see that formula over and over. Well, now houses can be a little different. Everybody's probably heard of Victorian houses, sort of fancy. 1860 to 1910, you can wiggle a little bit in that period. When you look at houses, you look at what we call massing. So you look at it's like the bones. So you don't look at the makeup or the face, because you can get plastic surgery and screw with that stuff. But the bones, the massing stays the same. So Victorian houses, I always say it looks a little bit like a junk chicken laid it out, because they are so irregular. You know, that Greek temple was beautiful, right? You could fold that front in half. Perfect bilateral symmetry. This, it looks like there are like 8 different additions added on here at different times. If you were in an airplane looking down, it's pieces, parts everywhere. But Victorians, you know, they often have this sort of fancy porches. Looks like a gingerbread house with all that icing on it. We actually will call that gingerbreading. That is an official term, gingerbreading. It's what we call all these little decorative details. And it doesn't matter if it's big or if it's small. You see, there's certain things. So irregular floor plan and little details. But the big thing on buildings is how you move through space. And a Victorian house is going to make you move through space in a very special way. It's a floor plan. This is not a very big house, which, by the way, you could have built the entire thing for approximately $1,500 in 1908. Front door, and you're in a hallway. That's a lot of wasted space for a tiny house. So why would you waste it? Because it's important. Because you're sending a message on who has access to your house. You go to visit someone, they probably had a servant, even if they were middle class. They probably had at least a partial servant there part of the time. You don't just get to walk into someone's living room, even if you know them. Proper etiquette. And American society is very fluid. Your social status can go up or down, so people are very conscious of it. It's not like royalty, where no matter how much of a jerk you are, you're still royal. American society, you can really go up and down based on wealth and connections. That hallway is going to be a holding pen. And you're going to be met in that hallway. And if you're the right kind of person, the right kind of day, they might open a door to the parlor. The door to the kitchen is always going to be shut. You don't get access there beneath your status. They don't want that to be seen. In that hallway is the most important piece of furniture they own. It's one that probably none of you own. You might see it if you go to an antique store. It's a hall stand, a hat stand. Hall stands, you look at them. You have a small mirror, because it's all about how you look, right? You gotta look good. Check appearances. You have pegs for top hats. Top hats were the fashion accessory of this era. They don't have closets the way we have closets. You can't be putting one of those in a dresser drawer. You're gonna make an accordion out of it. And you wanna show it off. So you have little knobs for your top hats. You have a small table, they're only about this big enough to put your calling card on because you had a calling card. That's how you notified someone. You couldn't text them to say you dropped by. You notified them with a little card that had your name on it to say you had been there. And then sometimes the bigger ones on either side was a place for an umbrella, which we sort of like, umbrella? That was like the latest technological advance. They'd only been around a handful of decades. People were just starting to own umbrellas. You needed a place to put it where it wouldn't get your floor wet, and you wanted to show off the fact that you were wealthy enough to have umbrellas and an umbrella stand. So that's what lived in your hall, and that's how that space was controlled. At the outside of these, you're going to start to see family resemblances. It's that irregular space, the porches. Now this is a 2-story one with the tower. Here's our little 1-story one. But it's the same way if you go to family reunions. There's a detail of some of that gingerbreading. It's more gingerbreading. This one's over a window cornice. But this is the bigger version. When you start to put those pieces, parts together. Small version. I think this might be one street over from Bank Street. I love this house. But you can start to see, it's like going to a family reunion. Everybody has like the same eyebrow, right? You can follow that trait. And some of them are the fancy ones. Yeah. I would not want to be maintaining woodwork on that house, but it is a stunning house.
I don't want to clean that house.
Yeah, I know. Well, that brings up a really great transition for the next one, because when the Victorian fell out of era, one of the next major styles is called Craftsman. Roughly 1900, 1905 to 1925. Craftsman houses are totally different. Predominantly 1 to 1.5 story. They are predominantly working class. You can find some large examples, but most of them are working class. And they're bringing people in out of farms, and they're starting to get factory jobs, and they need houses. And this is saying you've made it. This is sort of, again, middle class. And you might have indoor plumbing. You might actually have a real bathroom in this one. One bathroom for the whole house, but 20 years earlier, you would have had an outhouse, so this is progress. These houses are different. The first thing you'll see, they're much more rectangular. So if you were bird's eye view looking down, it's gonna be a simple rectangle and maybe one little projecting snout sort of on the front, maybe. That roof line, you've got this gable roof and it looks like someone pushed their thumb on it and the whole thing pushed down a little bit. It's a really wide roof. Oh. You see these rafter tails? You see how they're exposed? Do you guys ever go by houses when they're building them? And you've seen them put a roof on, right? And they put the rafters on. But when they put the shingles on, they enclose all of this, right? They use boards and they seal it up because you don't want squirrels and stuff up in there. The design hallmark for these is you leave the rafter tails exposed. So think about this. Somebody in marketing had to come up with the idea that you were going to sell the homeowners that they really wanted this feature, which cost you, the builder, less money because you're leaving part of the house unfinished. And you just made this a character-defining detail for the style. Somebody was really good at marketing. Multiple windows. They have electricity, but the average light bulb's about 18 watts. You're not gonna see a whole lot with 18 watts. So they don't have the technology to do big sheets of glass yet, by our standards, so they will do what we call ganging windows, where they put 3 and 4 windows together in big groups, like this. Columns are kind of old-fashioned, they're kind of over columns. They don't want the curlicues of the Victorians, they want mass production simple. You're gonna go with square piers. Sometimes they're called square columns. Floor plan changes, and this is where it gets interesting. People got tired of cleaning houses because they had, it's one of my favorite things ever, what they literally called a servant crisis. If you were to pick up a ladies' magazine for this time period, they talked about a servant crisis because women were going into factory work because who wanted to be a domestic? Well, if you don't have anyone to clean your house, regardless of how big it is, it's a problem. They're just starting with technology. Vacuum cleaners, they're sort of starting to come in, but they're not very good. You don't have a hallway anymore that you go into. There's no front vestibule. You walk right into a living room. That's a very different use of space and how people work through space and move through space. And the living room is often connected to the dining room to make one big open area. And there's often not a door between them. It's normally just kind of an opening. And the thing they really played with, and I don't have a photo of it here, but they had built-ins. If you've ever been in a Craftsman home, they often have built-in bookcases, built-in china cupboards, sometimes built-in dressers. And that makes a huge difference because if you've got like a freestanding piece of furniture on the floor like this, do you know how many like dead bugs, dust bunnies, balls of dog hair, I mean just everything gets under here, right? Then you gotta try to clean it out. But if it's a built-in china cupboard or a dresser that goes all the way to the floor, your furniture's built into the wall. And it comes with the house, so it saves you some money. So the Craftsmen are much more egalitarian. It's designed for the new working class and where Americans thought they were going. And at this point, the Victorian was just old-fashioned. These are these tapered piers I told you about. And here we have some ganged windows, and there you've got a string. They have these brackets. They look wonderful. They're totally decorative. They serve no structural purpose whatsoever, but they make the house look pretty. And you'll start to see as we move through them, you can really see them here because they're painted red. instead of seeing all that Victorian millwork, we have a lot of masonry showing up on our porches. It's lower maintenance. Well, until you paint it. Once you paint it, you've got more maintenance. But if they leave it unpainted, you're good. Here we even have big broad side lights, so it gives you more light in that front room. And then you start seeing automobiles, which means they're making little porte-cocheres, like little porches for their cars. Now, modern cars can be a little big for some of these, but for the cars in 1900s, these fit really nicely. And you will walk through our neighborhoods and you will see these. But people cycle through. I mean, things get faddish, they get tired, so then all of a sudden Craftsman's old school. Nobody wants Craftsman. So we start to have two new styles, and I'm going to focus a little bit on commercial and government buildings. Futurism and brutalism, aren't those great sounding names? So futurism, you kind of are like, okay, that deals with something that's going to be in the future. Brutalism, what's that sound like? Brutal, heavy, aggressive, yeah. So this is futurism, roughly 1910, 1915. The Italians started it. It was an Italian movement. Roman architects, very young. And they looked around at all those Roman ruins and they said, we're done. We want it all gone, all of it. Tear it down, every last one. We have nothing to do with this. This is not our world. We are young. We have power. We are all about hotels and train stations and shipping terminals. And this is what we want our world to look like. Most of them were killed in World War I. So most of it we just have drawings for. But you do see ideas. This is Paris. This actually is Notre Dame down here. So this is Paris. Except Paris doesn't look like this. But in the 1920s, an automobile manufacturer kept thinking, how do we get more autos in Paris? Those streets are kind of quagmire-ish. They're medieval streets from the Gothic era. You can't get a car through them. We'll fix it. We'll just bulldoze most of Paris and we'll start over. Here we go. This is what Paris is going to look like. Kind of looks like tenement slums. Thankfully, they didn't build it, but this was a very legit idea. Here's a drawing of it. By the way, this is the airplane landing area. These are apartment buildings. These, they look like ants. Those are cars. Do you see any people in here? Yeah. Because they were so carried away with the idea of the machine and what the machine could do, they forgot about the people. That's going to give us a disconnect on architecture eventually. So how do you move through space? How do you control people? What do you do when you have this grandiose architecture? You guys recognize this one? What is it?
Courthouse.
Courthouse, 1975. Brutalism. It's an example of brutalism, which is mostly concrete. It is designed to be powerful. If you're building a new courthouse and you want people to feel this big when they walk up in front of it, you want to remind them that they do not have the power, that the power is here. Can you think of a better architectural style? And it does its job really well. This is actually a good example of brutalism, except that right now nobody likes brutalism, but it's a really good example. First time I saw it, I'm like, wow, and my friend's like, what? I'm like, it's a really good example, and they just kind of looked at me like I had the plague. But it is, and it does its purpose. It shows you what they were thinking and how they wanted you to move through space, that you had to feel small and respectful here. But styles change again. So about the same time, we have a subset. It's called neo-formalism. Formal. You kind of know where that's going. Neo just means round two, because they've done it once. You guys recognize this? It's that weird looking bank building, isn't it? I almost drove off the road the first time I saw it. I was like, oh my God, look at the bank building. I talked my way into it. You know, I got the original blueprints for that this week. They went up in the attic and got them. It's a good thing I wasn't a bank robber because I literally have the blueprints for the building now. So, fabulous building. And I see it, and the first time I see it, I think Jetsons. But the other image that came into my mind, which most people probably don't get, oh, and here's the first cousin of it, so I don't want you to think it's a standalone. This is a style, you can see family. And neo-formalist buildings, they're very geometrical. They're taking those classical proportions, but they're not putting the fancy things on. They're just making them kind of shapes. So take classical architecture, just make it your most basic building blocks. So we're back to this. It's changed a little. It had more drive-throughs originally. But I saw this. And the first time I mentioned this, I had a friend who was like, okay, I don't understand where you went. You just went crazy on me. And I'm like, this is a temple to Athena at Delphi in Greece. Classical architecture. There's not a whole lot left, but it's a tholos. It's a round temple. That's what it looked like when it was put together before it fell apart. So you're starting to see a family resemblance now, where you have this building. So that neo-formalist is going back to classicism. So the Victorians said we want everything new that we can make by machine, and the craftsmen said we need to do it smooth and quick and get it out for people to live in their spaces. The futurists said blow it all up and start over. The brutalists said we're just going to remind you that you have no significance. But then the neo-formalists come back and like, we want to go back to proportion again, and balance and harmony, but in a modern way. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to take all the pieces apart and streamline it, which takes us back to our bank. There's another Greek temple. So you start to see, when you look at all these buildings, they're all controlling how you move through space, and how you move through space depends on your gender and your social status, and sometimes your race. But they also have very distinct references to all these other countries and all these other movements that you may or may not realize, but you still often react to these buildings the same way, because they're actually pretty good at what they do, which is sort of how you move through that space. Well, I'm completely shocked because I actually ended early on this one. The last two I didn't. But are there any questions? Wow, I'm gonna get something. Okay, I'm gonna assume I was that brilliant in explaining it all. I figured that overloaded on carbs from lunch. What are you guys going to next, do you know?
It's our last one.
Medical?